When Ethan Walker stepped out into the morning cold and looked up, the sky was no longer a sky. For one strange second, his mind refused to name what he was seeing. The world above his cabin should have been a pale sheet of winter blue, streaked with high clouds and a slow silver drift of freezing vapor from the ridge line. Instead, it had become iron and shadow and light. Warships hung over the valley in perfect silence, so vast and still they made the mountains look temporary. Their hulls blotted out the dawn in layered rows, dark as storm fronts, their undersides cut with lines of white gold lumens that glowed through the frost haze like captive stars. Ethan felt the cold air seize in his throat. His boots stopped on the top step of the porch, one hand still on the half-frozen latch behind him, the other bare to the wind because he had only meant to check the antenna mast before breakfast. The metal railing under his palm bit with the kind of cold that made skin feel thin. Somewhere to his left, the old beacon tower clicked and groaned as ice shifted along its rusted frame. Somewhere farther out, beyond the shale flats and the fuel tanks and the frozen creek bed, colony sirens began to rise one by one, uncertain at first, then steady, as if the whole settlement had woken at the same terrified breath. Ethan did not move. He could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness, a dull thud in his ears, too human, too small for what was above him. There had to be at least 30 of them. Maybe more. Different classes, too, if his tired memory of freightport silhouettes meant anything at all. Spear-shaped frigates. Heavy carriers broad through the middle. Needle-thin escorts holding formation at the edges. None of them showed markings he recognized, but they moved with the confidence of military power, not merchants, not survey ships, not customs patrol. These were vessels that did not come down from orbit to ask questions. Frost crackled beneath his soles as he stepped off the porch and into the yard, drawn forward in spite of himself. The whole valley had changed color. Snowfields that should have been pink with early sunrise now shimmered with shifting bands of silver and blue from the ships above. The windows of his workshop reflected an armada so massive it seemed impossible that he had not heard it arrive. But that was the worst part. No thunder. No engine roar. No shaking ground. Just presence. Just weight. Just the crushing certainty that something enormous had decided to stand over his life and look directly at it. A gust slid down from the ridge, carrying the mineral smell of ice, old machinery, and wood smoke from the colony below. Ethan swallowed hard. He thought of taxes overdue, of a cracked thermal pipe, of the generator coughing through the night, of every ordinary problem that had filled his head yesterday and now seemed absurdly fragile. Then, against his will, his thoughts turned to the girl sleeping inside his cabin. The injured alien with blue skin, blood on her sleeve, and eyes too sharp for someone half frozen when he found her. The stranger he had pulled out of the dark because leaving her there had felt more wrong than fear. Ethan stared at the warships filling the sky, and for the first time since dawn touched the ridge, one truth landed colder than the wind. They were not here by accident. They were here because of her. And whatever had started the night before had just reached his door. 12 hours earlier, the valley had belonged to the wind. It came down off the ridge in long, knife-cold streams that rattled the loose siding on Ethan Walker's cabin and made the old beacon mast sing in thin metal whines. The thermometer bolted beside his door read 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and dropping. Inside, the heater pushed out more sound than warmth, and the smell of hot dust and burnt wiring hung over the single-room cabin like a permanent season. Ethan stood at the narrow counter with a mug of reheated coffee in one hand and a diagnostic slate in the other, watching red warning bars crawl across the screen. Beacon Relay 12 had lost phase lock again. Of course it had. The relay was older than the colony, patched so many times it looked less like equipment and more like a stubborn promise made out of scrap. He took a slow sip, tasted metal and bitterness, and glanced toward the frost-rimmed window. Beyond the glass, the dark rolled over the snowfields in layers, and the last wash of daylight had already gone violet at the edges. There were men in the settlement who would have ignored the alert until morning. Ethan knew that. He also knew that if the beacon went fully dark in this weather, some cargo skiff or medrunner coming in low through the pass might find the mountain before it found the valley. So he set the mug down, reached for his insulated work jacket, and muttered the same thing he always did when the universe asked for one more favor. "Fine. You win." The porch steps groaned under his boots as he headed into the cold. The snow had crusted over after sunset, sharp enough to crunch like broken glass beneath his soles. His headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the blowing frost, catching flakes that flashed white and vanished. The beacon tower stood about 80 yards from the cabin on a rocky rise, its service ladder caked in rime, its relay dish turned slightly off true. Ethan climbed with gloved hands and shoulders hunched against the wind, every rung biting through the leather. Halfway up, the valley opened behind him, a dark bowl of ice, storage tanks, and scattered colony lights glowing amber through the night. Quiet. Too quiet, maybe. He noticed it only because the beacon had gone silent. No ticking actuator. No low-frequency hum. Just the wind and his own breath. He reached the maintenance housing, popped the panel, and leaned into a nest of cabling stiff with cold. The fault indicator blinked at him in angry orange pulses. He was swapping out a cracked coupler when something moved below, too fast and low to be drifting snow. Ethan froze. The beam from his headlamp swept across the rise, over frozen brush, a half-buried crate, the narrow service path leading toward the northern wash. Nothing. He listened. At first there was only the rush of air through the mast. Then, faint and uneven, came the sound again. Not machinery. Not an animal, either. More like someone trying very hard not to make a sound at all. Ethan climbed down slower than he had gone up. By the time his boots hit the ground, the wind had shifted, carrying with it a smell he did not recognize at first. Ozone, yes. Snow, certainly. But under that was something sharper, almost mineral, like rain on hot stone. He moved along the service path, sweeping the light over the drifts. 10 yards out, he found the first sign. A streak across the snow. Not dark, like oil or mud. Blue. He stopped so suddenly his breath smoked past the beam. Another mark lay farther ahead, then another, disappearing toward the wash where the rocks broke the wind. Ethan's fingers tightened around the flashlight. The colony sat 300 miles from the nearest decent port, and strangers did not just wander into this valley by accident. But whatever had left that trail was hurt, and in Ethan's experience the universe rarely bothered to make its test subtle. He followed the marks into the dark, the beacon behind him clicking weakly back to life, and somewhere ahead, hidden between stone and ice, something breathed in a frightened, careful rhythm that sounded far too human to ignore. The trail led him into the northern wash where the land dropped into a shallow cut of black stone and wind-packed snow. Out there, the cold changed character. It no longer moved like weather. It sat in the rocks and waited. Ethan kept his light low, more from instinct than strategy, and followed the blue smears where they crossed the drift in broken intervals, as if whoever had made them had been staggering, stopping, then forcing themselves onward. The wash narrowed ahead beneath an overhang of old ice fused to the cliff face in cloudy layers. One hard winter after another had built it there, foot by foot, until it looked like a frozen wave caught halfway through collapse. Ethan slowed when he saw the disturbance beneath it. Snow had been kicked aside in a rough crescent, exposing dark gravel, and near the base of the ridge a section of ice had fractured into pale veins that spread outward like lightning trapped in glass. His flashlight found a hand first. Slender. Blue. Bare to the wrist. It lay against the snow as still as carved stone except for the faintest tremor in the fingers. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. Then he moved. She was wedged partly under the broken lip of the ice shelf, not crushed, but pinned in the worst possible way, one shoulder trapped beneath a slab no thicker than a door and likely twice as heavy. Her body was turned awkwardly on the slope, dark clothing dusted white, the fabric sleek and unfamiliar, too fine for a miner and too practical for anything ceremonial. A tear ran along one sleeve, and beneath it the blue of her skin looked almost luminous in the beam, like color held under clear water. Her hair was darker than the night around them, braided in places, loose in others, with tiny crystals of frost clinging to the strands near her temple. Ethan crouched fast enough that his knees cracked. Up close he could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, but there. Thank God. The words passed through his mind without ceremony. She could not have been much younger than him, maybe mid-20s by human standards, though he knew better than to assume too much from an alien face. What he did know was that she was freezing. Her lips had lost most of their color, and a set of metallic restraints circled her wrists, linked by a narrow band of dull gray that gave off a faint pulse every few seconds. Not decorative. Not civilian. Ethan frowned. There were tiny lights along one cuff, 3 of them dead, one still glowing amber. He had spent enough years fixing broken systems to recognize controlled power when he saw it. Whatever those things were, they did not belong on anyone trying to cross a mountain wash alone at night. His light passed over her face and her eyes opened. They were not human eyes, not exactly. The shape was familiar enough, but the color caught him off guard, a pale silver blue with a reflective depth that flashed under the beam like moonlight on steel. Awareness came to them all at once. Fear came with it. Her hand jerked toward her side, searching for something that was not there. Easy, Ethan said, lowering the flashlight at once. His voice sounded too loud under the ice. Easy. I am not going to hurt you. She stared at him without blinking. Even half frozen, there was pride in that look, and calculation. Her chest rose once, sharply, and when she spoke her voice came out low and rough, as if each word had to cross a field of broken glass. Human. The single word held warning, distrust, and something like disbelief. Ethan glanced at the slab trapping her shoulder, then at the cuff on her wrist, then back to her face. He could ask 100 questions later. Right now there was only one fact that mattered. She was alive, she was trapped, and the temperature was still falling. He slid his gloves tighter, planted one boot in the gravel, and reached for the edge of the ice. You can hate me after, he said quietly. First, I get you out. The ice did not want to move. Ethan felt that the moment he put his weight into it. Cold shot through his gloves, through the tendons in his wrists, all the way to his shoulders as he tested the slab and found just enough give to hope and not nearly enough to feel confident. The woman beneath it watched him with those clear silver-blue eyes, unblinking, her breath turning to faint white ribbons in the beam of his flashlight. Up close he could hear the small involuntary sound she was trying not to make whenever the pressure shifted against her shoulder. She hid them well. Pride was stitched into her as tightly as the dark fabric on her arms. Ethan adjusted his footing on the gravel and tried again, lifting just enough to take some of the weight off her without sending the whole shelf cracking down around them. The slab rose an inch, maybe 2. That was all. His arms shook immediately. He set it down with care and blew out a breath that steamed in front of his face. Okay, he muttered, more to the ice than to her. You are heavier than you look. Her gaze flicked to him sharply, and for one strange second he thought she might actually be offended by the joke. Then the hard line of her mouth returned. Leave me, human, she said. The words were clearer this time, though still worn thin by cold and exhaustion. Ethan looked at her. He took in the restraint around her wrists, the torn sleeve, the pale frost caught on her lashes, and the expression that was trying very hard to look fearless. No, he said. Her eyes narrowed. You do not understand. More may come. Then we should both stop wasting time, Ethan replied. He set the flashlight between 2 rocks so the beam hit the ice shelf at an angle, then shrugged off his tool bag and dug through it with stiff fingers. He found a thermal patch, a compact pry bar, a spool of utility line, and the small collapsible jack he used for lifting relay housings into place on the tower. It was not meant for rescue work, but most of Ethan's life involved using the wrong tool until it became the right one. He slid the jack beneath a fracture line near the base of the slab, braced it with the pry bar, and began ratcheting slowly. Metal clicked in the quiet. Ice creaked in answer. The woman's breathing changed. Not panic exactly. More like calculation being forced to make room for uncertainty. Ethan kept his voice level while he worked. If that thing on your wrists is going to explode because I touch it, now would be a pretty useful time to mention it. Her eyes moved to the cuff, then back to his face. It is a compliance lock, she said after a pause. Ethan gave a humorless little laugh. That sounds unpleasant. It is. Another click. Another strained groan from the ice. The slab lifted a little higher this time, enough for him to wedge the pry bar deeper and steal one more inch of space. He could feel sweat forming under his collar despite the cold. His breath came faster, louder in his ears. A sharp tone suddenly pulsed from the restraint on her wrist, a single electronic chirp that made them both freeze. Ethan stared at it. One amber light had turned red. Her face did not change, but something colder than the wind entered her voice. You should leave now. Ethan looked up toward the ridge, into the blowing dark beyond the wash. He could hear nothing except the wind and the thin complaint of stressed metal from the jack. But the night no longer felt empty. He did not know who had put that lock on her. He did not know what she had escaped from. What he did know was simpler and somehow heavier. Somebody out there wanted her found. He tightened his grip on the ratchet handle and forced the jack one notch higher. The slab shifted enough for her shoulder to come free. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her at once. Can you move? He asked. She tried. Pain flashed across her face before she buried it. Not far, she said. Good enough, Ethan answered. Then, before either of them could argue with the decision, he reached down to lift her out of the ice and into the dark. She was lighter than he expected and heavier in all the ways that mattered. Ethan caught her before her knees gave out on the gravel, one arm around her back, the other under her forearm, careful of the shoulder that had been trapped beneath the ice. Even through his gloves he could feel the cold radiating off her, not just from the night but from the deeper dangerous chill of someone who had been losing heat too long. For a second she stiffened against him, every line of her body rejecting the contact on principle, but the moment she tried to pull away her breath hitched and her weight sagged again. Ethan tightened his grip just enough to keep her upright. Easy, he said. That word again. It sounded almost foolish in a place like this, with the wind scraping over the rocks and the red light on her wrist restraint pulsing like a watchful eye. The wash suddenly felt too narrow, too exposed. He looked up toward the ridge. Snow moved in thin silver sheets across the higher ground, and the dark beyond them had begun to feel arranged rather than empty, as if the night itself were listening. We are leaving, he said. The woman turned her face toward him, her expression sharpened by pride and pain and disbelief. Why? She asked. Ethan blinked. The question landed harder than it should have. Why? As if mercy required accounting. As if a freezing stranger had to earn the right not to be abandoned in a mountain wash. He shifted her arm more securely over his shoulder and reached down with his free hand for the flashlight lodged between the rocks. Because you are hurt, he said. No. Her voice was thin but steady. Why are you helping me? The red pulse on her restraint flashed again. 1 beat. 2. Ethan stared at it, then at the slope leading back toward the beacon path. There was not enough time for the truth in all its messy unreasonable simplicity, and maybe she would not have believed it anyway. So he gave her something easier, something a little rougher around the edges. Because I hate bullies, he said. The answer came out dry, almost irritated, the way he spoke when a generator blew at midnight or a supply clerk tried to short him on parts. Anybody who puts metal on a person and leaves them under ice does not get my vote. For the first time. Since he found her, something shifted in her face that was not suspicion. It was too small to call surprise, too guarded to be gratitude. More like confusion arriving in the space where fear had been living. Ethan adjusted the beam of the flashlight and started guiding them up the wash. Her steps were uneven, one boot dragging slightly in the snow-crusted gravel, but she was walking. That was enough for now. The climb back felt twice as long with her leaning against him. Wind pushed at their backs, then their sides, searching for gaps in fabric and skin. The smell of ozone still clung faintly to her clothes, mixed now with ice, stone, and the faint medicinal tang of whatever the compliance lock was made of. Ethan kept listening for engines, voices, anything that would tell him they were no longer alone, but all he heard was the beacon tower finding its rhythm again in the distance and the harsh little breaths she was trying not to let him notice. Halfway to the path, she spoke without looking at him. That is a childish reason. Ethan gave a tired huff that almost became a laugh. Maybe, he said. But it works for me. She was quiet for 3 more steps. Then, so softly he almost missed it beneath the wind, she said, "You are either very stupid, human, or very dangerous." Ethan looked ahead at the dim outline of his cabin lights through the blowing frost and tightened his hold before her footing slipped again. "Tonight," he said, "I am just the guy who has a heater." And in the silence that followed, she did not argue. By the time Ethan got her through the cabin door, the inside air felt almost tropical compared to the world outside, though the heater still clicked and coughed like an old man arguing with his own lungs. Warm dust, machine oil, and weak coffee wrapped around them in a tired little cloud that would have embarrassed him under any normal circumstance. Tonight it felt like wealth. He kicked the door shut against the wind, slid the deadbolt into place, and guided her toward the only chair in the room that had not already become a parched shelf. She did not sit at first. She stood there swaying slightly beneath the amber glow of the overhead strip light, eyes moving over everything with a kind of disciplined suspicion. The narrow cot against the far wall. The cluttered counter with spare relay couplers and soldering tools. The old enamel sink. The thermal blankets folded in a crate by the heater. Even exhausted, she assessed the room the way other people checked exits. Ethan had seen that look before in drifters and freight crews who had learned the universe collected debts without warning. "Sit down," he said, setting his flashlight and tool bag on the table. "You are one stubborn gust of wind away from hitting the floor." Her chin lifted a fraction. "Your shelter is inadequate." Ethan looked around at the patched insulation, the exposed conduit, the cabinet door that had not closed right since summer. "That is the nicest thing anybody has said about it all year," he replied. Something unreadable passed through her expression, then she lowered herself into the chair with careful control, one hand still near the side seam of her dark outer layer. Ethan noticed the motion and stored it away. He pulled the med kit from beneath the sink, set it on the table, and crouched by the heater long enough to turn the output up 2 notches. The coils glowed a deeper orange, throwing warm light across her blue skin and turning the frost at the ends of her hair into tiny drops of water. Up close, the damage looked worse than it had in the wash. The shoulder that had been pinned was already stiffening, and beneath the torn sleeve he could see a shallow burn tracing along her upper arm, angry at the edges but clean. The compliance lock still circled her wrists, dull metal now beaded with meltwater. One red light remained active. Ethan opened the med kit and laid out what he had: thermal packs, antiseptic spray, a scanner wand that only worked when it felt appreciated, and a roll of smart bandage that had expired 3 months ago but still adhered better than half the colony's promises. "I need to look at your arm," he said. "No." The answer came fast enough to sound reflexive. Ethan glanced up. Her silver blue eyes were fixed on him, clear now, no longer blurred by cold. There was strength in them again, and caution sharpened to a point. "Fine," he said evenly. "Then I will just sit here and watch you lose heat while pretending that is a strategy." She stared at him for 3 long seconds. Then, without speaking, she extended the injured arm. Ethan moved slowly on purpose, giving her time to object, to flinch, to reconsider. She did none of those things, but her free hand remained tucked close to her side beneath the folds of her coat. Hidden. Guarding something. Ethan pretended not to notice. The antiseptic hissed softly over the burn, filling the room with a sterile citrus smell that did not belong in a frontier cabin. She did not react beyond a slight tightening around the mouth. Tough, then. Or trained. Maybe both. He scanned the shoulder next, reading the flickering display while the heater rattled behind him. Bruised. Strained. Nothing broken that he could see. Lucky, he said under his breath. Her gaze shifted. I do not believe in luck. Ethan sealed the burn with a bandage and sat back on his heels. That makes two of us. Outside, something passed over the roof. Not a landing. Not a person. More like a low mechanical hum crossing above the cabin and moving on. Ethan went perfectly still. The woman in the chair did the same, but unlike him she was already prepared. In one smooth motion, her hidden hand came free with a slim metallic blade no longer than his palm, its edge catching the heater light with a cold blue glint. She held it low, not at him, but ready. Ethan looked at the knife, then at her face. For a moment neither of them breathed. Then he said, very quietly, next time you hide a weapon in my cabin, at least wait until I finish the bandage. For the first time since Ethan had pulled her out from under the ice, the room felt truly small. The heater rattled in the corner. Meltwater ticked from the hem of her coat onto the warped cabin floor. The blade in her hand was narrow and elegant, not improvised frontier steel but something balanced, deliberate, and expensive enough that Ethan knew she was not who she looked like in the wash. Outside, the low mechanical hum passed over the roof again, slower this time, and the window above the sink flashed with a pale moving light. Not lightning. Not weather. Search pattern. Ethan rose carefully, palms visible, while her gaze tracked every inch of him. I am not your problem. Right now, he said. She did not lower the knife. You should be afraid of me. Ethan gave the window a quick glance. At the moment, I am more concerned with whatever is flying lazy circles over my house. The light swept past the glass again, thin and blue-white, probing through the frost at the edges. It was too controlled for civilian traffic and too quiet for a cargo shuttle. Ethan moved to the counter and killed the overhead strip. Darkness folded over the cabin except for the heater coils and the weak glow from the monitor beside the sink. The woman's blade became a sliver of shadow in her hand. Better, Ethan murmured. Less to look at. Her voice came low from the chair. If they are using atmospheric trackers, darkness will not matter. Ethan turned toward her. They. She held his stare for one long beat, then looked away first, not in surrender but in calculation. That alone told him something. People who were merely frightened did not speak like that. People who had been hunted did. The hum outside stopped. Silence settled so suddenly it felt placed there. Ethan crossed to the window and lifted the corner of the thermal curtain 1 inch. A narrow beam drifted over the yard, paused at the beacon path, then moved on toward the equipment shed. A drone, then. Compact. Probably scanning for heat signatures, metal tags, transmission leakage, maybe biological markers if whoever owned it had deep pockets and bad manners. Ethan let the curtain fall. He was already thinking in routes. The cabin had 1 door, 2 windows, and no honest way out if the thing decided to get curious. But the old relay maintenance tunnels beneath the beacon ridge still connected to the decommissioned storm shelter on the far side of the wash. Barely. He had crawled them once in summer to run replacement cable and had promised himself never again. Tonight counted as special circumstances. He turned back toward her. Can you walk? A little. Can you walk without collapsing and making me regret all my life choices? A pause. Probably. Good enough. Her eyes narrowed faintly, but the knife dipped half an inch. Ethan grabbed a thermal blanket, 2 heat packs, his tool bag, and the shortwave field transmitter he kept charged for outages. He slung the bag over one shoulder and crossed to the storage. Bench near the floor hatch. You are leaving? She asked. I am relocating, Ethan said. You are the complication that came with the evening. There was that almost surprised look again, gone as quickly as it came. You could surrender me, she said. Her voice had sharpened in a different direction now, no longer defensive, almost testing. Whoever is looking for me would pay well. Ethan pulled up the hatch cover with a grunt and was rewarded by a draft of stale underground cold and the smell of dust, insulation foam, and old concrete. He looked back at her over one shoulder. Lady, I fix weather beacons for a living. If I wanted to get rich by making terrible decisions, would have left this planet years ago. The words hung between them while the beam outside crossed the yard again, brighter now, lingering at the porch. He held out the thermal blanket. After a second, she sheathed the blade somewhere beneath her coat and took it. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to her. Then, from above the cabin, came a sharp electronic chirp followed by the soft metallic tap of landing gear touching his roof, and whatever fragile argument the night had left them disappeared at once. The sound on the roof came again, a delicate metallic tick followed by a low scanning whir that moved from one end of the cabin to the other with patient precision. Ethan did not waste a second on surprise. He dropped into a crouch beside the open floor hatch and jerked his head toward it. Move. The woman was already on her feet, thermal blanket wrapped close around her shoulders, the silver of her eyes reflecting the dim orange heater coils. For one instant she hesitated, listening to the machine above them the way a hunted animal reads weather. Then she crossed the room with a limp she was trying and failing to hide. Ethan caught her elbow, steadied her down the first narrow rung, and followed with the hatch cover half lowered behind him. The cabin above disappeared into a thin slice of light, then into darkness that smelled of old cement, wiring insulation, mineral dust, and the trapped cold of forgotten places. Ethan clicked on a low-beam work lamp and the maintenance shaft came alive in a tunnel of weak amber. Pipes ran along one wall under layers of patch foam and frost. Conduit bundles sagged from rusted brackets. Meltwater dripped somewhere deeper in the dark with slow hollow taps, like a clock built by people who had stopped caring about time. Ethan pulled the hatch down until it almost sealed and listened. The drone moved across the roof again, then paused directly above them. A faint electronic trill answered from the woman's wrist restraint. Ethan looked at the red light pulsing on the cuff and swore under his breath. That thing is talking to it, he said. Her voice came low from 2 rungs below him. I told you darkness would not matter. Ethan started down after her. You also told me to leave you in the snow. Not your best recommendation so far. The shaft opened into a service corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without touching shoulders. Ethan led the way, lamp low, tool bag bumping against his hip, boots scraping over concrete powdered with decades of dust. The woman followed more quietly than he did, even injured, even tired. There was discipline in that silence. Training. Not the kind people picked up on cargo routes or border stations. Real training, the expensive kind built into posture and breath. Ethan had noticed pieces of it from the beginning, but down here with the world narrow to light, shadow, and footfalls, the pattern stood out harder. He stopped at a junction where the corridor split around an old pressure door crusted with corrosion. Left led to the relay trunk beneath the ridge. Right connected to the decommissioned storm shelter, assuming the collapse 2 winters ago had not finished the job. Ethan crouched by a wall panel and pried off the cover. Manual override still worked if you were stubborn enough. He usually was. Behind him, the woman spoke into the dim without preamble. You did not ask for my name. Ethan kept working the release lever. You did not offer it. Most would have searched me. Most would have removed the restraint and contacted local security for payment or favor. Ethan snorted softly. Local security would take 3 hours, ask 12 stupid questions, and charge me for the call. Metal groaned as the lock pins retracted. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Besides, I found you under a chunk of ice, not drifting through customs with luggage. The work lamp caught her face at an angle, silver blue eyes, blue skin turned darker in the tunnel shadows, wet strands of dark hair clinging near her temple where the frost had finally melted. She looked at him with a kind of focused disbelief that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "You still do not know what I am." Ethan straightened and gave the rusted door a shove until it opened 2 feet with a protesting shriek. "Lady," he said, breathing a little harder from the effort, "I know exactly what you are. You are injured, freezing, and being chased by something expensive. The rest can wait until morning." Her gaze held on him in the weak amber light, searching his face as if it might finally reveal the transaction hidden underneath the kindness. It did not. For a second the tunnel seemed to go quieter around them. Then, very softly, almost to herself, she said, "What kind of species does this?" Ethan frowned. "What kind of species fixes old beacons in the middle of nowhere and crawls through frozen maintenance shafts at midnight? The kind with terrible life choices, probably." He stepped through the half-open door and held it for her. For the first time since he had found her, the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the memory of one. Then somewhere behind them, from the shaft beneath the cabin, came the sharp crack of metal giving way, and both of them knew the drone had decided to stop being polite. The sound behind them did not repeat, which somehow made it worse. Ethan had spent enough years around failing machinery to know the difference between damage and intent, and whatever had entered the shaft beneath his cabin was no longer guessing. He guided the woman through the half-open pressure door, pulled it shut with both hands, and dropped the manual locking bar into place. The old mechanism shuddered, complained, then settled into a reluctant hold. Not strong. Not permanent. Just enough to buy minutes if the universe was feeling unusually charitable. The corridor beyond sloped downward toward the storm shelter, narrower here, with condensation purling along the ceiling pipes and cold air flowing over the floor like invisible water. Ethan kept the lamp low and moved as fast as the cramped passage allowed, listening to her steps behind him. They were slower now. More careful. The adrenaline that had gotten her out of the wash and through his cabin was fading, and pain was starting to collect its due. 50 feet ahead, the corridor opened into the shelter chamber, a concrete room built decades ago for weather emergencies no one talked about anymore. A rusted supply rack leaned against one wall. 2 old cots sat folded in brackets. A dead monitor hung above an emergency console with a cracked screen and a dust-coated keypad. Ethan set down the lamp, crossed to the auxiliary power box, and hit the starter. For a long second, nothing happened. Then the ceiling strips flickered once, twice, and came alive in a weak amber hum that made the room look like a memory. He turned just in time to catch her bracing a hand against the wall. Her shoulders had gone rigid beneath the thermal blanket. The red light on the compliance lock was blinking faster now, every pulse answered by a faint clicking sound from somewhere inside the metal. "Sit," Ethan said. That was not a suggestion. This time she obeyed without argument, lowering herself onto the edge of one cot with the same controlled dignity she had used in his chair, as if exhaustion were a negotiable rumor. Ethan knelt in front of the emergency console and began scanning frequencies with the field transmitter, not to call anyone yet, just to learn who else was awake. Static. Weather traffic. A mining crew complaining about a frozen fuel line. Then, for less than 2 seconds, a burst of encrypted chatter rolled across the band in a language he did not know, clipped and precise, followed by a coordinate packet he only partly understood because one identifier repeated twice. Sector designation. Ridge line. Structure below surface. Ethan went still. They knew there was something under the cabin. Or they would soon. He shut the scan off and looked back at her. The room had warmed by maybe 3 degrees. Not enough to matter. Enough to reveal details the tunnel had hidden. The dark clothing she wore was not civilian issue at all. The seams were too fine, the fabric too responsive, adjusting fit as she moved. A thin geometric pattern ran along one sleeve in a material that caught the light only when she breathed. Military or diplomatic, he thought. Maybe both. Her face, now fully clear of frost, carried the sort of composure people learned when failure had consequences larger than themselves. Ethan leaned against the console and folded his arms. "All right," he said quietly. "We are out of easy answers." "Who are they?" The woman looked at him for a long moment. The hum of the ceiling strips filled the silence between them. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was still tired, still roughened by cold, but the hesitation was gone. "They are not here for a criminal," she said. Ethan did not move. "I figured that out when the knife turned out to be worth more than my truck." Her eyes held his, unreadable and reflective as winter water. "My name is Lyra Vane." The name meant nothing to Ethan, which apparently told her something important, because a strange expression crossed her face, not offense, not relief, something more fragile than either. "You truly do not know me," she said. "Lady," Ethan replied, "I fix storm beacons on a frontier rock. The list of people I know is aggressively unimpressive." A faint breath escaped her, almost a laugh if she had trusted the sound enough to let it live. Then she looked down at the lock on her wrists and the amber room seemed to dim around her. "I am the last direct heir of the Astery Coalition Command," she said. "If they take me back, this system does not get a quiet morning." Ethan felt the words land in him piece by piece, slow and cold and impossibly heavy. Above them, somewhere beyond layers of concrete, pipe, and ice, the mountain gave off a distant metallic groan. Then the shelter lights flickered, and for the first time that night Ethan understood that whatever had followed Lyra into his valley was large enough to reach the sky. They did not sleep so much as endure the hours until morning. The storm shelter held heat about as well as it held hope, which was to say poorly and with visible strain. Ethan found 2 emergency thermal wraps still sealed in a wall locker, a dented flask of potable water, and a pack of nutrient bars that tasted like sweetened cardboard. Lyra accepted the water, ignored the bars at first, then took one when he stopped pretending not to notice her hands shaking from exhaustion. The compliance lock on her wrists kept up its slow red pulse. Through the night, a metronome counting down toward something neither of them could name. Once, near what Ethan guessed was 3 in the morning, the old field transmitter crackled by itself and spilled 3 seconds of encrypted static into the room before going dead again. Lyra's eyes lifted at the sound with a look Ethan had seen only in people who knew exactly how large a mistake could become. He sat on the floor with his back against the emergency console, boots stretched out, tool bag beside him, and watched the weak shelter lights carve shadows under her cheekbones as she rested on the cot without ever fully relaxing. Up close, even wrapped in borrowed silver insulation and frontier dust, she still carried something formal in the line of her shoulders, something that made the small concrete room feel temporary around her. Not superior. Just trained for a world that had never allowed her to be ordinary. Ethan broke the silence once, maybe because the night was too full and his own thoughts had started sounding unreasonable. "You could have told me sooner." Lyra looked at him from across the dim room. "Would it have changed your choice?" Ethan considered that. The humming lights. The smell of dust and old wiring. The faint ache in his hands from lifting ice and forcing rusted doors. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a second longer, and in that second some hard private calculation inside her seemed to shift by 1 degree. Then she looked down at the red light on her wrist again and said, very quietly, "That is why your species is dangerous." Ethan let out a tired breath that almost became a laugh. "Most people just call us stubborn." Near dawn, the shelter ceiling gave a low vibrating tremor, not an impact, not a collapse, but the kind of deep mechanical resonance that belonged to something massive moving through the sky. Ethan was on his feet before the second pass. The room itself seemed to listen. Concrete dust drifted from a seam above the pressure door. Then came the colony sirens, muffled by rock and distance, rising in uncertain waves from the valley above. Ethan looked at Lyra. Her face had gone very still. "Did you call them?" he asked. She did not answer right away. "Last night, while you were treating my shoulder, I triggered a dormant emergency pulse through the compliance lock," she said. Ethan stared at her. "You had a beacon in that thing the whole time." A narrow shadow of regret crossed her expression. "Not a beacon. A distress inheritance code. It was never meant to reach this far into the frontier." He almost said something sharp, something about warning a man before turning his valley into a galactic problem, but the tremor came again, stronger now, and whatever words he had fell apart in the noise. Ethan grabbed the work lamp, shoved the shelter door open, and climbed the corridor back toward the cabin hatch with Lyra close behind him. The air in the shaft had changed. It carried a faint metallic tang and a pressure that made his ears feel full. When he pushed through the hatch and stepped onto the porch, the cold struck first. Then the light. Then the sky. Warships hung over the valley in impossible formation, row after row of dark hulls and white gold running lines swallowing the dawn. Frost glittered on the rail beneath Ethan's hand. Below, the colony was awake in scattered motion, doors opening, figures gathering, faces tilted upward in fear. Ethan heard himself breathe once, sharply, and understood with sudden brutal clarity that this was no longer a story about a stranger in the snow. Whatever had found Lyra had found all of them. Beside him, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket with her dark hair stirring in the wind, the last heir of a starborn command looked up at the fleet and whispered one word that carried no relief at all. Too soon. The valley did not know what to do with a sky like that. People came out of prefab homes and equipment sheds in half-fastened coats, gloves forgotten, faces pale in the cold, every eye drawn upward toward the silent armada blotting out the morning. The colony sirens kept wailing for another 30 seconds before somebody at Central Ops finally killed them, as if silence might make the scene easier to survive. It did not. Ethan stood on his porch with the frost burning through his socks inside his work boots and felt the old railing tremble under his hand. Beside him, Lyra had gone still in a way that was somehow more alarming than fear. The silver emergency wrap stirred around her in the wind, catching the white gold glow from the ships above, and for the first time Ethan understood what rank looked like when it had been forced into hiding. Not arrogance. Wait. The kind that changed the air around a person whether they wanted it to or not. A ground transport from Colony Administration came up the access track 10 minutes later in a spray of ice crystals, engine whining too high because the driver had pushed it harder than the machine liked. It stopped crooked in Ethan's yard. Out stepped Mara Quinn, chief coordinator for the valley, wearing her heavy brown field coat over a sleep shirt and thermal pants, her gray hair half braided and half escaping in the wind. She was the sort of woman who could negotiate mineral rights, broken fuel allotments, and 2 drunk contractors before breakfast without raising her voice, which was probably why the panic in her eyes mattered as much as it did. "Ethan," she called, not taking her gaze off Lyra for long. "You want to tell me why I woke up under an invasion?" Ethan folded his arms against the cold. "Working theory is that it followed her." Mara's jaw tightened. "I guessed that much." She stepped closer, boots crunching in the frost, and lowered her voice even though half the colony was openly staring from below the ridge. "We have 3 separate transmissions on emergency band demanding immediate cooperation with a lawful recovery operation. They have not fired. They have not threatened. But I have 42 families down there looking at me like I can somehow talk to the sky." Ethan glanced at Lyra. She said nothing. The wind moved a strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she did not seem to notice. Mara followed his look and exhaled slowly through her nose. Then she did what frightened leaders always do when they run out of good options. She made one sound practical. "If turning her over keeps this valley standing, I need to consider it." Ethan's head turned back toward her. "Consider it," he repeated. Mara did not flinch. "Do not make me the villain because I count heads, Ethan. I count them because somebody has to." Down in the colony, a child started crying. Somewhere else a generator coughed to life. Above it all, the fleet waited with impossible patience. Lyra spoke at last, her voice calm enough to cut through the cold. She is not wrong. Ethan looked at her sharply. Her eyes stayed on the ships. If I go willingly, they may leave the settlement untouched. May, Ethan said. Lyra did not answer, which was answer enough. Mara saw it too. Her shoulders lowered by an inch, the posture of someone arriving at a decision she hated. Ethan felt something inside him settle just as plainly. It was not courage. It was simpler than that and harder to excuse. A line. The kind a person finds out he has only when the world finally steps on it. He moved without drama, one step forward, then another, until he stood between Lyra and the track leading down to the colony. Mara stared at him as if he had lost his mind. Ethan, do not. He kept his eyes on the valley below, on the frightened people and the silver morning and the shadow of ships hanging over all of it. Last night, he said quietly, she was freezing under a sheet of ice with a tracker locked to her wrists. If the people up there were the kind you could trust with a surrender, she would not have been in my valley to begin with. The wind moved through the yard, carrying wood smoke, engine exhaust, and the metallic taste of snow. When Ethan spoke again, his voice stayed level. I do not know anything about star empires. I know enough about bullies. And I am not handing over somebody I promised to protect just because the threat got bigger. For a few seconds after Ethan spoke, nothing happened at all. The fleet remained where it was, immense and silent, its hulls holding the dawn in long bands of shadow and pale fire. Frost drifted through the yard in slow glittering threads. Mara Quinn stood with her hands half raised, as if she could still catch the moment before it tipped into disaster. Down in the colony, the people gathered between cargo sheds and habitation blocks, too far away for Ethan to read their expressions, close enough for him to feel the weight of their fear. Then the air changed. A tone rolled across the valley, low and resonant, not loud exactly, but deep enough that Ethan felt it in the porch boards under his boots and in the railing beneath his hand. One of the largest warships above them opened along its underside, not with violence, but with the smooth precision of something built by a civilization that expected obedience from physics itself. A column of white light descended through the cold and came to rest in the open ground beyond Ethan's fuel tanks, turning the drifting snow into silver dust. Mara took one involuntary step backward. Ethan did not move. Lyra did. She came forward until she stood beside him, the emergency wrap bright against the weathered boards, dark hair lifting in the wind, blue skin touched by the strange clean light from above. What had looked like exhaustion in her only minutes earlier did not vanish, but it drew into something narrower, sharper, more formal. Ethan saw her shoulders straighten. Saw the quiet become command. 3 figures emerged from the light and crossed the snow with measured steps. They were tall, armored in pale metallic plates that caught the morning like ice over deep water, their helmets open, their faces unmistakably of Lyra's people. No one in the valley spoke. Ethan could hear the heater inside his cabin ticking through the wall behind him. The 3 stopped at the base of the porch. The one in front bowed, not to Ethan, not to Mara, but to Lyra. When he spoke, his voice carried through the yard with the clarity of a broadcast. Air Lyra Vane, by authority of the Astery Coalition High Fleet, we have answered your distress inheritance code. The pursuing rogue elements have been contained in upper orbit. This settlement is under our protection pending your command. Ethan blinked once. Mara stared openly. The words seemed to take a moment to become real. Not invaded. Protected. Not hunted by the fleet. Rescued by it. Lyra said nothing right away. Her eyes moved from the officer to the sky above, to the colony below, to the people watching from a distance with all the helplessness of ordinary lives caught near extraordinary power. When she spoke, her voice was no longer tired. It was calm, carrying, and absolute. Then my first command is this. All weapons remain cold. No scans below civilian threshold. No detentions. No one in this valley is to be touched, questioned, or intimidated. The officer bowed his head at once. As commanded. Lyra turned then, not to the ships, but to Ethan. For a moment the entire impossible morning seemed to narrow around that small movement. The silver blue of her eyes held his with a clarity that made everything else feel far away. "This human sheltered me when he had no reason to believe me," she said, "and protected me when it would have been easier to surrender me. Let every ship above us understand what that means." The officer looked at Ethan fully for the first time, and something in his expression changed from assessment to respect. He placed a fist over his chest and bowed as deeply to Ethan as he had to Lyra. The gesture sent a visible ripple through the figures waiting in the light behind him. On the ridge below, people who could not hear the words still saw the shape of what was happening, and a murmur moved through the colony like wind through dry grass. Ethan stood there with cold hands, a tired coat, and frost whitening the toes of his boots, and could think of nothing to do with the honor being laid at his feet. Lyra studied his face and, with the faintest trace of that almost smile he had glimpsed in the tunnel, said softly enough for only him to hear, "You chose kindness before you knew my name. In my world, that makes you rarer than power." The officer from the fleet offered transport within the hour, medical care, secure passage, formal recognition from worlds Ethan had never heard of, and enough compensation to buy every rusted generator in the valley twice over. Ethan listened with one hand in his coat pocket and the other resting on the porch rail still crusted with frost, then looked past the man in polished armor to the colony below. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue lines. Someone had started a loader and then shut it down again. People were still standing outside in clusters, staring at the ships overhead as if they were afraid blinking would make the whole thing begin again. Ethan thought about fuel shortages, cracked greenhouses, Mara Quinn's headache for the next 10 years, and the beacon tower that still needed a coupler replaced before the next storm rolled in. He looked back at the officer and said the only thing that felt solid. "If you want to repay me, leave these people alone. No levies. No interviews. No memorial plaques. Just go without making my valley famous." The officer seemed uncertain whether he had been insulted or entrusted. Lyra, however, understood at once. Ethan saw it in the way her gaze softened, not with pity, never that, but with the quiet recognition of someone seeing the same answer twice and finally believing it was real. She spoke to the officer in her own language then, low and fluid and carrying the tone of command even when Ethan could not follow the words. The man bowed again, deeper this time. "It will be recorded," he said. "No contact without your colony's consent. No claim will be made on this settlement. No public record will identify him unless he chooses it." Mara Quinn let out a breath that fogged the air in front of her like something she had been holding since dawn. Ethan only nodded. That was enough. The formalities ended after that. The officers withdrew toward the waiting light. The pressure in the sky began to change as some of the distant ships shifted position, their enormous silhouettes gliding through the morning with slow impossible grace. Not retreating in haste. Reordering. Making room for peace the way lesser powers made room for war. Lyra remained on the porch a few seconds longer, the silver wrap around her shoulders bright against the weathered wood, dark hair moving in the wind that came down off the ridge. Up close, with the fleet no longer a threat but an answer, she looked younger somehow and far more burdened. Ethan realized then that rescue had not returned her to safety so much as to duty. She held out her hands without a word. Ethan hesitated, then reached for the compliance lock, found the hidden release the officer indicated remotely, and felt the metal loosen beneath his fingers. The cuffs fell away with a soft mechanical click and landed in his palm, suddenly just objects, dull and small and undeserving of the fear they had carried. Lyra rubbed one wrist slowly, watching him. "On my world," she said, "there are ceremonies for moments like this. Witnesses. Oaths. Histories recited so no one can pretend kindness did not happen." Ethan glanced toward the beacon tower. "On my world, we usually call it helping somebody out." That almost smile returned, fuller this time, touched with exhaustion and something warmer than amusement. Then she stepped closer and laid one hand over the cuffs still resting in his palm, not taking them, only covering them for a second as if to close the meaning of them. He felt the cold leave the metal beneath her touch. "You reminded me," she said quietly, "that power can protect without possessing." When she withdrew, the morning seemed larger and emptier at once. The transport light brightened in the yard. She turned toward it, then stopped at the edge of the porch and looked back one last time. Ethan did not wave. Neither did she. Some things were too honest for that. She only held his eyes across the frost and pale light and all the impossible things that had crossed one night between them, then stepped down into the silver beam. A moment later she was gone. The ships above the valley began to rise, one by one, until the sky slowly became a sky again. The silence they left behind was not empty. It was reverent. Ethan stood on the porch until the last white gold line vanished into daylight, the cold settling